In his name I begin with the best of blessings on the noblest of prophets and the Lord and beloved of our hearts, Muhammad and his progeny. Salawat. And in commemoration of Imam Jaffar Asaddiq, whom we are honoring this evening, Barakallahu lakum, the third, in your loudest salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Respected scholars, respected elders, sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Peace be upon you all. The pursuit of happiness is a task we are all embarking on. Happiness, of course, is defined differently for each of us. It could be materialistic, it could be like buying a car or a house, or getting the latest fashion item or video game. It can be spiritual, memorizing du'as and ayats from the Holy Quran, meditating for more than 5 minutes, or making sure to pray all of our prayers or making them on time. It can relate to the most simple of goals to the most complex, from learning how to tie your shoelaces or getting a CEO job at a company, or learning how to have a fulfilling and successful marriage or relationship. It can also depend on the day-to-day of our required lives and tasks and demands. For example, going to the gym, buying, preparing meals for the week, or cleaning out the garage that has been sitting for 5 years not being touched. In the end, this pursuit of happiness can be superficial with a lot of the examples we have just mentioned, or it can go deeper. Again, this will be individually based. However, the type of happiness that I would like to focus on this evening is based on the pursuit of knowledge. For how else will we understand what happiness truly is, if not on the understanding of gaining knowledge and applying it to our lives at the material and spiritual level, which also encompasses the psychological. I ask that everybody please keep your silence and your focus here, because we're going to be exploring a lot of very interesting things that you may not have come across before, you may have. So I ask that you kindly, with the loud salawat, proceeded with salawat, silence please, salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
From an Islamic perspective, our beloved Prophet Muhammad from 1400 years ago encouraged the pursuit of knowledge from the cradle to the grave, as well as to seek knowledge even as far as China. These are famous ahadith that we know. What do these beautiful ahadith effectively tell us to do in a world that can be at odds with the age of ignorance in the 21st century? If we take this a step further, we can apply this ignorance in the form of many social problems and challenges we experience here in our communities that are affecting both the youth and the elders. This evening, as we commemorate the martyrdom of our beloved sixth Imam Jaffar Asaddiq alayhi salam, we will explore the importance of the pursuit of knowledge in today's modern challenges that we face through the psychological and mental health lens that will allow us to understand and apply the following hadith of our honored Imam. Take action in teaching traditions of the Ahlul Bayt to your children before the corrupted persons proceed in corrupting them. So, let us begin with getting to know a little bit about who we are commemorating tonight in order to apply the wisdom of his legacy. I won't be speaking about the full details of the Imam's life or the historical aspects, as this will need more time than we have. So I do recommend that you read some literature or you listen to the many lectures that are available out there to discuss and learn about these details. I would also like to mention that I am not a scholar, but I'm a humble servant, inshallah, trying to explore and discuss these ideas from a psychological, social, and mental health perspective. So as we know, the Imam was born on the 7th of Rabi' al-Awwal in 702 AD in Medina, and grew up in the presence of divinity of his father Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and his grandfather Imam Zain al-Abidin, who, as we know, were both witnesses to the tragedies of Karbala. With such a personality in his life for 12 years, with his grandfather, he witnessed the political, religious, and psychological after effects of Karbala, which no doubt left a lasting impression on him and his followers, where he used to summon the traditions of recitation gatherings in Arabic known as what? As the majalis, to which the followers of Ahlul Bayt hold dear in reviving and continuing to spread the message of the authentic Islam of the prophets. The Imam continued growing under the guidance of his father until the age of around 31, where he became the next Imam after the martyrdom of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. It's interesting to note that his mother, Fatima bint al-Qasim ibn Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, was the great-granddaughter of Abu Bakr, where al-Qasim was an important jurist in early Islam, and Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr was the adopted son of Imam Ali alayhi salam, and was one of Ali's earliest supporters and generals. During these turbulent political times, both Imam Zayn al-Abidin and Muhammad al-Baqir pulled away from the Umayyad political climate and focused their attentions on spreading the teachings and religious sciences of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Imam Jaffar Asaddiq also witnessed this political turbulence and kept his distance, as he knew to rise against the Umayyad, as some of his relatives wanted to, would have not been successful. And he kept his attentions on the same path while the clashes of the Umayyad and the Abbasids targeted the followers and descendants of Ahlul Bayt. And this was done through the persecution and murder of the descendants of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. We have all heard and learned about these descendants, these Sayyids, being buried alive as part of the building walls in the city of Baghdad that until today, that can be seen in the walls of the old bridge by the Tigris River. Now the Imam himself was constantly harassed and mistreated by the Abbasid Khalifa, Abu Ja'far Abdullah ibn Muhammad al-Mansur, who was threatened by the Imam's knowledge and spreading of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, as the Imam continued in spreading the message and ignoring and minding the politics. Al-Mansur, in his arrogance, constantly challenged the Imam with his own scholars who consistently conceded to this knowledge. The Imam was also continuously summoned from Medina to Baghdad at least 5 times, where Al-Mansur couldn't find sufficient grounds to imprison him. Coming as often as he did to Iraq only served, as we can see here, to spread the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, even more. And in the process, of course, infuriating Al-Mansur, who then sent him back to Medina, where he was monitored and harassed. Despite this harassment, the Imam kept the traditions of our beloved Imams with his impeccable character and virtues, as well noted by historians. And these characteristics we know as hospitality, helping the needy and secrecy, charity, and so on, as these were the akhlaq of the Imams. It is still under this harassment, however, that the Imam propagated knowledge and was well famed throughout the Islamic world, where thousands came to learn from him, including scholars of jurisprudence, tafsir, and hadith. Interfaith discussions and debates were also well known, where many embraced Islam, including atheists, those who do not believe in God. Our Imam also taught to students mathematics, chemistry, medicine, and astronomy. And amongst his pupils were also the founders of other schools of thoughts in Islam. This is also where we get the term Ja'fari jurisprudence, where Shia jurisprudence was named after the 6th Imam. Now, another interesting fact about Imam Jaffar Asaddiq was his family life. He married Fatima al-Hasan and had 2 sons, Ismail and Abdullah. Ismail was later seen as the Imam by his father by a group, after his father by a group, and until today this offshoot is known as the Ismailis. He also married a former Berberi or Andalusian slave by the name of Hamida Khatun, whom he freed, trained as an Islamic scholar to which she was revered widely. So you can see here that women were also celebrated for their knowledge and contributed to Islamic history. The Imam later married Hamida and had 2 sons by the name of Musa al-Kadhim and Muhammad. We know that Musa al-Kadhim later became the 7th divinely appointed Imam of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Through this marriage, we learn an important lesson. We see the encouragement of interracial marriage as modeled by our Imam, which is still an issue amongst the different cultural Muslims in our society today, especially when it comes to marriage outside of our own culture. This is one of those things where we can refer back to the guidance within our societies as to how the Imams modeled marriage based on faith and taqwa, which is piety, as opposed to race and lineage. He married a former black slave, basically. So this is something very important to learn from in our society today, where we have a lot of racist views. It was during this time frame that the followers of the Ahlul Bayt were given the name of what? We said Ja'fari, but what else? Rafidiyun. So this is an interesting fact. We hear this today, but we don't know where it originated. It started during this time frame. So what does this word mean? It means the rejectors, which we proudly wear today, knowing what we are rejecting. And we can see history repeating itself. And those who follow the Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam, just as they were targeted back then, arrested, imprisoned, and murdered for that love, we see it rampantly today with the Rafidiyun, as is the way of the lovers of the beloved. Salawat. ثانية بأعلى أصواتكم.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
At the age of around 64 or 65, on the 15th of Shawwal, our beloved Imam was murdered, as is the way of our Imams, through poisoned grapes under the Khalifa of Mansur. He wanted to end the Imamate through, and was widely known to have said, to behead the person chosen as the future Imam. Now Imam Asaddiq knew this, and what did he do in his wisdom? He chose 4 people rather than 1 to be leader after him. So who did he choose? The governor, his son Abdullah, Musa al-Kadhim, and who else? It's almost like a joke, including al-Mansur himself. You see the wisdom in here, what he's done? So al-Mansur, of course, backed out from what he stated, right? Because the beheading included his own self. So of course, he can't be the leader who's going to get his head chopped off, right? So after Imam Jaffar Asaddiq was buried in the famous Jannat al-Baqi' in Medina, where both in 1806 and in 1925, on the 8th of Shawwal, the Wahhabi Saudi Alliance razed the grounds of the beautiful domes and shrines of this land that till today is being desecrated and insulted with new buildings of public washrooms, public shopping centers that are being built upon these holy grounds. Those who visit Medina and try to visit these graves on the Baqi' grounds are harassed and prevented from visiting, as we do the same ziyarah in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and other parts of the Islamic world. It is the stab in the heart of the Ahlul Bayt followers that Jannat al-Baqi' is in such a state today, where annually worldwide we hold protests to condemn the desecration and destruction of these precious Islamic heritage sites. Last weekend in the city of Ottawa, the Baqi' organization held its first Canadian protest as part of a worldwide movement to mobilize this issue and to lobby governments to put pressure on the Saudi Wahhabi regime with demands. It is a movement that I encourage all the young people here and the elders to take part, as in the part of protecting our Islamic identity and to rebuild the shrines from the rubble that we see now to the architectural splendors of the harams we see worldwide for both Shia and Sunni imams and scholars. I pray that we need to protest no more And inshallah, we get to visit these holy graves of the Baqi' and give our proper condolences to Imam al-Hasan al-Mujtaba, son of Ali, Imam Ali, Zain al-Abidin, son of Hussein, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, al-Baneen, and of course, Imam Jaffar Asaddiq, alayhi salam, salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
So now that we have a little bit of a background, and inshallah, our respected Sheikh will be giving more information of the Imam. Let's take a look now at the theme of tonight's lecture, which was what? The pursuit of knowledge from the jewel of the hadith of Imam Jaffar Asaddiq. Take action in teaching traditions of the Ahlul Bayt to your children before the corrupted persons proceed in corrupting them. Now let's examine this hadith in mind with the Islamic perspective of the Prophet's advice on how to raise children in comparison to modern psychological perspective of child development and its impact on our mental health and the social issues that we are continually experiencing, including how we pursue knowledge and how the pursuit of knowledge should be encouraged. This is, of course, in honor of Imam Jaffar Asaddiq and his relentless oath to spreading the sciences and teachings of Ahlul Bayt despite the difficult climate he was up against. So this makes you think, what reasons do we all have and what excuses do we all have in our modern luxury that does not encourage us from pursuing that knowledge? So I want you to keep this in mind as we explore these ideas. In Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi's book, Islam, Faith, Practice, and History, he outlines that Islam has divided the upbringing of a child into 3 stages up until the age of 21. The division is based on the following hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. The child is master for 7 years, and is a slave for 7 years, and a vizier for 7 years. So if he grows into a good character within 21 years, well and good. Otherwise, leave him alone, because you have discharged your responsibility in front of Allah. The same hadith has been examined by Imam Jaffar Asaddiq. Let your child play up to 7 years and keep him with you for education and training for another 7 years. Then if he succeeds, well and good. Otherwise, there is no good in him, which again means the parents step back from that responsibility because they have done all that is required of them. Now, in each of these 3 stages, we are told in detail what the physical, emotional, and spiritual developments are, and why it is important to teach certain behaviors to the child that involves the journey of acquiring knowledge. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the details because this takes a lot of psychological, in-depth details, but again, I encourage you to look and research more into it. There's not a lot of time this evening to do that. But let's compare and analyze some of these developments within the 3 main stages of development from Islamic perspective to a modern psychological theory of child development from the psychologist named Dr. Erikson. So those of you who are going to study psychology later on, you may come across this person and you could say, I learned it in an Islamic lecture. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Now this doctor, he postulates 8 stages of development into adulthood and beyond, and these are known as Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. We know Islam's 3 stages are broken down in the following, like we said. The first stage, from birth to age 7. The second stage, from 8 to 14. And the third stage, from age 15 to 21. Erikson, he breaks down the stages as the following. Pay attention. Number 1, hope, basic trust versus basic mistrust. This is from the age of when they're born to 18 months. Number 2 covers from 1 to 3, and this is known as will, autonomy versus shame. The third stage is from 3 to 6 years old, so this is preschool, and this is known as purpose, initiative versus guilt. Number 4, this is the school age from 6 to 11 years old, And this is called fidelity, identity versus role confusion. Number 6 is the first stage of adult development. And so this is about love, intimacy versus isolation. Stage 7 is the second stage of adulthood. And so this is between the age of 35 to 64. And this is known as care versus stagnation. And the final stage, number 8, is the age group affected of 65 and above. And so this is called wisdom, ego, integrity versus despair. Now, for tonight's lecture, I want to focus on the first 5 that correlate specifically to the Prophet and the Imam's 3 stages. So the first stage is described from an Islamic perspective, as we know, as a carefree period, where the child is considered as a master of his parents. So in this age, the child plays and is not yet fully developed for education or formal instruction. Now, this doesn't mean that the child still is not learning, right? They can still understand things, and mashallah, I've already met some amazing young people here that are just brilliant, very young, but mashallah alayhum, azkiya, very brilliant. So the child in this age group is constantly influenced by the atmosphere which he or she lives in. So they learn by observing, right? And imitation, they copy what they see. Sometimes we may say something good or bad, and you notice if you say something bad, right away they pick up the bad, right away. So that's why we have to watch how, as parents or as elders, brothers and sisters, you have to watch what you do and model in front of these young minds, because they're absorbing it in, and they copy you, the good and the bad, subhanAllah, huh? So it's absolutely necessary for our parents to provide good examples by their behavior. So if you're going to argue or fight, parents, do it separate in front of the kids, because it's going to follow that behavior. Now, although the child is not ready for this formal education, our imams still have emphasized that religious issues, very basic and simple ones, should be introduced to them gradually, shwaya shwaya, right? So this is the most important point to remember, the graduality at this stage in the child's life. The following hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Fadl from the Imam is very significant to understand when you understand what graduality means. So when the child reaches the age of 3, listen to this. Teach him 7 times to recite what? La ilaha illallah. When the child is 3. من الطفل عمره 3 سنوات علموه يقول لا إله إلا الله. Then leave him till he is after 3 years, 7 months, and 20 days. So look here, very specific. There's a science behind this that we are only now learning about from the Quran, from the Hadith, from 1400 years ago. So it's amazing. This was back then, but we're only now learning through the child development and psychology and research how these specific details, we understand them now more through our research. So the Imam continues. He says, then train him to say, Muhammadan Rasulullah.
صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Then leave him at that till he completes 4 years old. Then teach him 7 times. من الطفل يصير عمره 4 سنوات علموه يقول صلى الله على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
The hadith continues, then leave him at that till he reaches the age of 5. Then see if he can distinguish between the right and left hand. When he knows the difference, then make him face the qibla. Where's the qibla in this? So then teach the child to face the qibla and tell him to do sajda. Okay? This is to continue till he is 6 years of age. Then he should be told to pray and taught ruku' and sajda. Again, when he completes 7 years, then he should be asked to wash his face, his hands, and then told to pray. This will continue till the age of 9, when he should be taught proper wudu for prayer and proper salah, the age of 9. When he learns proper wudu and salah, Allah forgives the sins of the parents. So we look at this from a psychological point of view. There's a lot of psychomotor. That means the movement of the hand, the body, the brain development, different functions, as well as spiritual development. through the different ages and the graduality, step by step, how we teach our children. Let's compare the stages here that we looked at from an Islamic perspective to Dr. Erikson's 3 stages that also reflect similar dimensions. So the first stage, we said from infancy till 18 months. This is the most fundamental stage of life, according to the doctor. Whether the baby develops basic trust or basic mistrust, the thukha, okay? And it's not merely a matter of nurture, it's nature as well, what they're saying. It has to be taught. So it is a multifaceted and has strong social components. It depends on the quality of the maternal relationship between the mother and child, the bonding, العلاقة بين الأم والطفل. So the mother carries out and reflects their inner perceptions of trustworthiness and personal meaning on the child. So this is where the baby begins to trust. When he cries out and the mother reaches out to help the child knows when they cry out for the mother, they're going to get that. So you develop trust that way. So this creates a sense of identity for a child that young. And then this failure to develop that will cause a bit of distress later on. So the next stage, we said from 1 to 3 years old. Mothers, can I have the mother's attention, please? الأمهات رجاءً هاي معلومات جدا مفيدة لتربية الأولاد. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So this frame from the child is 1 to 3 years old. This is where we introduce the concept of autonomy, so learning independence versus shame and doubt. So the child begins to discover the beginnings of their independence, and parents must slowly facilitate the child's sense of doing by letting them do things on their own. So putting their shoes on, eating by themselves, going to the washroom, things like that. So you encourage your child to do that because then they develop their sense of independence and trust in themselves. The third stage, preschool. So the child is around between 3 to 6 years old. So these are the questions. So does the child have the ability to do things on their own at this point, such as dress himself or herself? So if guilty about making his or her own choices, the child is not going to be able to function well. So Dr. Ericsson has a positive outlook on this stage. What does he say? He says that the most guilt is quickly compensated by a sense of accomplishment. So a child who feels that they're not independent or able to do something, that can quickly go away if you encourage them after they've accomplished something. So I want you to pay attention here. You should be paying attention anyways, but the point. Again, we can see from the Islamic perspective, there is much emphasis on the spiritual development through the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt traditions at a young age to create routine, okay? And familiarity with duties like prayer that will become obligatory on each gender when they reach the respective age. So we know for girls it's usually around 9 years old, and for boys 13, 14, or 15. It depends. So the second Islamic stage, from age 8 to 14, this is the age when the child's mind starts to grasp logical reasoning, and it is developed for formal education. So the brain is really developing at this point. I see a lot of young people around this age too, mashallah. And today they were very interactive in our discussions, and they're very bright. So it's very important that the child is not only be educated at this age, but at the same time he or she should be raised with the proper Islamic ethics. By saying that the child is a slave from 8 to 14, what the Prophet wants to emphasize is that at this age, the parents should be strict, okay, in disciplining children. Now discipline, we're not talking about hitting here. This is not accepted in our faith, in our religion, but it's used in our cultures and back home as a form of cultural discipline. We can't do that. That's not the way of the Ahlul Bayt, that's not the way of the Prophet. It is by culture and it is not accepted in our teachings. So this is why sometimes there's problems between the parents and the children and the generational conflict. I'll get into that more a bit later. So we continue with this idea of what does it mean for a child to be a slave.
that he has to follow the instructions of the parents and the teachers and not be a servant. Okay, there's a difference. You cannot be a servant to the parents, which is misinterpreted a lot by families, resulting in maladaptive trust building and development between parents and children. This can also be seen in the social, familial issues that we encounter with cross-generational, so the elders of our community and the young, and cultural conflicts. What that means is our parents who were raised in a different culture, enforcing their culture on the kids that are growing up in this mixed culture. So this is where the problems occur between the parents and the children, especially growing up in a society where our children are constantly bombarded with dual cultural exposure that can cause dual cultural identity conflicts or crisis. Does this make sense? So a lot of us grew up here. I grew up here. And alhamdulillah, my parents followed this in terms of having a strict, religiously cultural upbringing. But when we go to school, we are bombarded by everything that is not Islamic, that doesn't follow our ethics and our culture. So that's why we grow up with that duality, the two cultures from home as well as from when we're at school. And if a child is not taught properly by their family, by the ethics, by the mothers, by the elders, by the fathers and the community, then you will have this conflict of identity. You get confused. What is my identity? Who am I? What am I? Am I Canadian Western? Am I Muslim, Arab, Pakistani, Iraqi, fill in the blanks, you know? What am I? Who am I? And the child can have, we already go through this anyway, so then you have on top of it our Islamic identity, along with our age and the bombardment of what we have in our society today. Many, many issues. So this is, again, crucial, where the parents and the elders of the community have that responsibility, like the Imam was saying, to teach young the routine, so it doesn't become a shock when a girl becomes 9, you have to start praying, fasting, and wearing hijab. How do you expect a 9-year-old to do that around that age when you did not teach her growing into it? Or a young man to pray and fast and do all of these things when he was not taught growing up? Of course it's going to be a shock. Of course it's going to be a rebellion. So these are things we have to do, like the Imams were saying, in graduality, step by step. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Now it's interesting to see how in the sayings of the Prophet and the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, 3 things have been emphasized for the male children in the second stage. Number 1, literacy for secular knowledge, so not necessarily just Islamic studies. Number 2, religious knowledge. And number 3, physical education and martial arts. The beauty of martial arts is something that we have forgotten. Jiu-jitsu, karate, and all of these. This is a culture that teaches discipline to our children and how to work in a community. And these are things that were taught by the Imam to teach our children and the young men. For example, the Prophet said, it is the right of the male child on the father to teach him the book of Allah, writing and swimming. Imam Jaffar Asaddiq says, it is the duty of the father to teach his son writing. This is the core of religious development at this stage where the main hadith we are exploring tonight comes into play. Religious education is very crucial at this stage so that the child's religious beliefs are based on sound reasoning and firm foundation, and like I just said earlier, not a complete shock. Literacy and seeking of secular and religious knowledge has been equally emphasized for the girls, not just for the men. However, instead of physical education, the ahadith talk about specific subjects which would help girls in becoming good wives and educated mothers. Now, what does that mean? Now, the reason for that is because the destiny of future generations of the Ummah, as we know, depends on the mothers who are learned, informed, and aware of their role in establishing a society which is always conscious of Allah's presence. Now, this poses a very fascinating question when it comes to gender roles in our culture. Although the hadith outlines different types of upbringing for each gender, let us not forget the social and time context. Okay, what does that mean? In which these hadith were propagated. It was in a time of tribes and the warrior type of climate, where men were the dominant warrior provider type and the women were the caretaker type. If we apply Imam Ali's famous quote of, you guys know which one I'm talking about, right? Do not raise your children the way your parents raised you. They were born for a different time. We can see how this also can apply to modern gender roles today between men and women, and the challenges we have in our homes when raising children, but also the demands of modern society that challenge the traditional gender roles, where women also now have taken up more of the physical and the different aspects of these roles. You see more women doing martial arts now. You see more women working outside of the home and being more engaged in society, because the times and our context demand that of women. You have women speakers now giving lectures and speaking, because the time demand for women to show that we are not women who are oppressed. We are women, part of a society that contribute equally, but in different ways. And we have the ability, just like men, in different ways of doing things. We still have to respect and honor our own gender roles, but it doesn't mean that we cannot still engage in society. Now, Ericsson outlines these stages with the following. So we looked at the 3 Islamic stages, and Ericsson stages correlating to that. Let's finish off with Erickson's stages. The 4th stage, he talks about the child being 6 to 11 years old. And so this is where the child develops competence or inferiority complex. So the child compares their worth, the thiqa bin nafs, to others. For example, in a classroom environment. So the child can recognize different disparities in personal abilities related to other children. So what they can do compared to other children. So the doctor places emphasis on the teacher, okay, who should ensure that the children don't feel inferior. Again, we see the emphasis on education, just like the Islamic perspective. But through the role of the education system, where from the Islamic perspective, it's from whom? Who's it from? The parents. From the psychological perspective here, they say that the educational system itself. So here we see the importance of both how parents need to be educated. So both the women, they need to be educated, and the men. Why? Because from an Islamic perspective, it is our duty to teach our children, right? And even say, even the mothers, let's say, who will not work, who don't plan on having a career, they have the role of raising the next generation. And so they have to have that education behind them. Finally, the 3rd stage of the Islamic development is from the age of 15 to 21. The Prophet described the upbringing where the child is an advisor for the next 7 years. So what does that mean? At the age of 14, 15 and up, a Muslim child is expected to become a responsible teenager. Therefore, the Prophet says that the parents should now treat him or more like a friend, rather than the slave term that we used earlier. At this stage, the parents should guide and help their teenage child to make correct decisions for themselves. So parents cannot enforce on the child, you have to do this, you have to do that. The parent will give the knowledge and the choice for the child to be able to make that decision. This is, of course, based on the upbringing we talked about before. If the parent has successfully gone through those stages, and you see the child, the young teenager now, has a mind, a sound mind, and is applying good reason to difficult situations, then you give the opportunity for that young man and woman to make decisions rather than the parent forcing it on them. I know culture is different, but we're not talking culture here. We're talking religion, what our Islam teaches us. So in the mid and late teens, the child has to start the specific training for the education, for the career, or whatever path that they want to pursue, so they can become more independent. It is also the time where the child, the young man or woman, is nearing marriage. So Islam has strongly emphasized that the parents should get their daughters and sons married at an early age when they have acquired mental maturity. That their higher education can continue even if they're married. And we see a lot of young people do that, alhamdulillah. But marriage should not be postponed for the sake of anything else, and this is encouraged in our faith. The condition of mental maturity, okay, cannot be measured by a number. So just because a girl is 16 or a guy is 19 or 20, خلاص لازم نزوجهم. No. It depends on the mental ability and capacity. And this is, of course, different from person to person. At the age of 21, the parent's responsibility towards the child is done. However, it's fascinating to see when we compare culture, الثقافة والتقاليد, to the religion, okay? We know that some of our parents don't stop at the responsibility of 21 and continue even after that 21-year-old is married and has a child of their own. Of course, this again depends on the maturity. However, we see this in our community as a challenge of conflict between the parents and the children that needs to be addressed and needs to be resolved in a sensitive manner. A collaborative and loving upbringing will also create the mawadda and rahmah and love for the child towards the parents. And in turn, the child, when they are older, they fulfill their obligations toward their aging parents. Finally here, for Erikson stages, along the same ideas we looked at from the Islamic perspective, stage 5, Erikson talks about 12 to 18. This is where identity comes in versus role confusion that we discussed earlier from our cultural and the duality of our culture, right? So the young man or woman here, they question themselves. Who am I? How do I fit in? Where am I going in life? And you know what? We still ask these questions when we're 20, 30, 40, 50. We're always asking these questions, but this is when it begins in child development according to the psychological theory. So, Erikson believes that if the parents allow the child to explore, they will conclude their own identity. It is, however, the parents who continually push, all right, and conform, ضغط, okay, push and pressure their own opinion and views on the child, this is where the confusion occurs. Because your child is not given the ability to figure things out on their own. And this is what the Prophet was saying as well, right? When the child becomes independent, they try to figure things out on their own. Finally, number 6. This is the first stage of adult development. And so this can be from the age of 18 to 31, which is where the Islamic third stage is developed as well, up until the age of 21. So this is the development that usually happens during young adulthood, love, intimacy versus isolation. So marriage, getting to know the opposite gender, relationships, friendships, families, this is all important during this stage in the life. So by successfully forming loving relationships with other people, including the opposite gender for the purpose of marriage, from an Islamic perspective, right? Individuals are able to experience love and intimacy. When we say intimacy, we're talking about emotional intimacy, trust, and being able to rely on other people. Those who fail to form these lasting relationships begin to feel alone, isolated, and rejected. From what we have explored this evening on the topic of pursuing knowledge through the hadith of Imam Jaffar Asaddiq, and I'm going to repeat it for the 3rd time. Take action in teaching traditions of the Ahlul Bayt to your children before the corrupted persons proceed in corrupting them. We can see how there is much emphasis on the Islamic value of knowledge for both females and males to embark upon themselves to further pass on to the next generation of Muslims in order to be positive contributing members of our society. We explored the psychological emphasis of development, where we can see how it can impact a developing young mind, mental well-being of the self, their identity, and where they stand in the world. By combining the wisdom of the prophets and the imams, which we have had for 1,400 years, with modern psychological theories and research, we see the value in empowering and encouraging the youth and the elders to seek knowledge at all stages of development in our lives. For how else will we prepare the next generation of lovers of the Ahlul Bayt without the powerful weapon of knowledge in a world where we are still besieged by the terror of the Muawiyah of the time to our Ali, by the terror of the Yazids of our time to our Hussein, by the terror of the Mansurs of our time to our Jaffar, by the terror of the Wahhabis of this time to our Mahdi. Salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
A night of sorrow we commemorate to the truthful one, As-Sadiq, spending his life under his grandfather Zainul Abidin and his father Muhammad al-Baqir, reliving the calamities of Karbala as though it was just the day before, reliving the message of Karbala through the majalis of sorrow and bala, keeping in our hearts the beating of the flowing blood of the truth and of the master of the martyrs, Sayyid al-Shuhada, against the oppression of his time, Rafidiyun were his followers called, so sublime, not a care for this name as a crime, holding this name with pride, and spreading the science, math, and truths of that time. Ja'fari Rafidi, he kept on teaching even to the blind, serving the poor in charity, in secrecy. He filled the minds and the hearts full of decency. And the ones who followed his mind truly become the ones sacrificed in the walls, sanctified for all eternity, as proof of good and evil for this modernity. How do you call yourself a Ja'fari? How do you truly call yourself a Ja'fari? How do you truly call yourself a Ja'fari if you do not engage your mind as the one poisoned with the grapes at night? Our hearts mourn this tragic loss. Through poison and beheadings we come across. Revive the Sadiq's past on the heavens of Al-Baqi at last, to freely visit him like we do our Ali, Hussein, and Al-Abbas. Ya Hasan al-Mushtaba, Ya Ali Zain al-Abidin, Ya Muhammad al-Baqir, Ya al-Baneen, and Ya Jaffar Asaddiq. In the name of the one where we do not know where she rests, Ya Fatima al-Zahra, we send our salams to you from our hearts, far imprisoned from where we protest, praying for the day we walk amongst your harams with no pain, as freely as the walk of the free of the Arba'een to your beloved Al-Hussein. Salatu ala Muhammad, sallu ala Muhammad.